Hello, everyone. I'm here today. My name is Neha Narula, and I'm the director of the Digital Currency Initiative here at the MIT Media Lab. And I am here with Gary Gensler, who is a senior advisor to the MIT Media Lab and a senior lecturer at Sloan, former chairman of the CFTC, and also Patrick Murck, who is a fellow at the Harvard Berkman Center, also a lawyer at Cooley, and basically a Bitcoin OG. He was the executive director of the Bitcoin Foundation, one of the non-corrupt ones. So we have a really interesting mix of people here today.
So that means that you're like Yoda for Bitcoin?
I'll take it, sure.
You'll take Yoda for Bitcoin?
I've been called worse. I've been called worse.
He has some interesting stories, which we won't get to on this Facebook Live, unfortunately, but maybe another one. So we have a technologist, a regulator, and a lawyer. And we can come up with a bar joke at the end of this. But we're here today to talk about regulation in the cryptocurrency space. So Gary, I want to start with you because you've been making some headlines this week. Why don't you give a summary of sort of what you've been saying and what's been going on?
Well, thank you, Neha, and it's great to be with Patrick. What I really think is there's a great potential for blockchain technology. It's already in its 9.5 years since Satoshi wrote his paper, brought some real changes underneath the hood of the world of finance. But I think for further adoption, to move to the next stage, basically, we really need to bring it inside the tent of public policy frameworks. We should be tech neutral. As societies, though, we've benefited for decades from ensuring that people pay their taxes. We've benefited to ensure that people don't fund terrorists. And yes, we've benefited from basic investor protections that came out of the Great Depression. So I think we need to bring this whole world into that. Modify some of the rules underneath the hood, change some of the specifics, but the time for this ecosystem, these crypto markets, to live outside of social policy norms, I think we have to get beyond that.
Yeah, okay, great. And Patrick, what's sort of your take on all of this?
So thanks for having me, and great to be here with you, Gary, of course. I tend to agree. I mean, I have a slightly different angle on it, but when we think about who's part of the community, right, these are social systems, right? So the more people we have in the community in any sort of social system, blockchain architecture is a social architecture as much as it is a technological one. The more voices we have as part of those conversations, the better these systems are going to get. That doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but it's good to have more voices. And we got to realize that this policy perspective is part of the community too, right? And a lot of these regulatory agencies are part of our community too, if we want to get this to that next level of adoption. But we should also be mindful of learning from each other, right? That, just because we have certain policies or regulations in place today, that they might, as you say, need to be adapted, learning from a policy perspective, learning from the other members of the community who have been here for a while, and they might have something to share on that.
And if I could add something to what Patrick has said, I think that an important part of the community that can join the community in a greater way are incumbents. I know that blockchain technology and much of its excitement is about disrupting centralized authorities, disrupting the incumbents. And I think that is terrific. And the incumbents, no, I really do. I think that the incumbents and centralized authorities, centralized institutions in the financial sector, while they've fostered a lot of economic growth, they've also challenged economic growth. And we've had crisis after crisis after crisis. We've had a lot of abuse. Consumers need to be protected, of course. And then the cost of the financial sector captures what's called economic rents, because they have a sort of a centrality that they can collect more dollars or euros or shekels or yen from the public. So I think that the disruptive nature of blockchain technology is terrific, but I think at some stage, why should it be, for instance, unregulated startup crypto exchanges that are serving the public and not some traditional exchanges. So there's a
excellent-
little bit of a
excellent
unlevel
question.
playing field right now.
So a few things that I'd like to say to respond to you guys. So first of all, sort of, Patrick, what you're saying about a dialogue, right? I think what was really important for me was I was coming into this knowing nothing about financial regulation really, other than it seemed very onerous. It seemed sort of like, oh, it has all these things you require that clearly don't make sense
And you want to stay
anymore.
away from it.
I want to stay away from it. There's all these things that it requires that just don't even make sense in this new world. How silly. We can't really, we just need to kind of put that over there, and we need to figure out how this technology should work, right? And in conversations with you, Gary, I've sort of come to realize, well, there are some higher level public policy goals that are important. Investor protection is important. Market integrity is important. And I think we all sort of agree that we want these things as a society, right? The question is how to get them. And I think that's where you and I differ a bit. But I've come a little, closer to thinking, okay, maybe the regulators aren't the bad guys. And also, we've been having a lot of conversations with people at the SEC and the CFTC, and I have just been so impressed by a lot of those people. And Patrick, I know you have talked to a lot of them as well. They are your former colleagues, Gary, right? And I've been so impressed with their desire to really understand the technology and to really work with it. I think a huge problem right now, though, is we still don't know where this technology is going, right? And we still don't know what the ultimate structure of this new system is even going to look like. And I don't think it'll map as clearly onto the existing system as you do. And so I think there's going to be some, there's just going to be some really big
And
differences.
Can I add something
Sure.
to it? Societies, we tend to be tribal. And so there's the public policy
Yeah.
or regulatory community or tribe, if one might. There's the commercial venture capital entrepreneurial community or tribe, if you might. And then there's also the technology community. They all overlap. There are people that can speak the various languages, but it still is a bit tribal. And as you've seen, the people at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and other regulators you've been meeting are actually trying to find out and meet the technology, meet the venture capitalists, and find appropriate solutions to get to investor protection. But there's still a lot of frictions. There's frictions in terms of how do the current rule sets align with the technology. And
Yeah.
there's also some frictions in terms of the tribal nature of the communities.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, Patrick. I want to hear about your experiences.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the questions is should we bring it in? Are these exchanges unregulated, or are they now misregulated? And I think there's an argument that it's not that the exchanges in the space and some other actors in the space are operating in a completely unregulated environment, that they're operating in a misregulated environment, right? That right now, if you wanted to operate a cryptocurrency exchange in the US, you're regulated as if you were Western Union or MoneyGram, which doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, as opposed to being regulated as maybe a commodity spot market or something like that, and a federal construct. So there's a lot of time and money and energy that's being wasted in conversations around how to regulate these things with maybe the wrong stakeholders, or maybe with people whose interests don't really align with what the public policy goals should be.
Did you see what the New York AG sent to Kraken and what Jesse posted?
Yes.
I don't know if you saw this, Gary. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I am a believer that these markets are international and certainly national markets, that they are better in a framework where they're regulated at the national level. And I do think that it is no longer a question of if, I think it's just how, that the Securities and Exchange Commission has spoken pretty clearly on this. And there's nearly 200 exchanges. Not all of them operate here in the US, and many are very small. But the large ones, the largest one here has 13 million customers. And so they're very significant, and collectively, these 200 exchanges make billions of dollars of profits. And so, in fact, they compete with the traditional exchanges in terms of profitability, for sure. And so I think it's time to bring it into that framework beyond the money. I'm agreeing with you. It's not MoneyGram. It's more like, excuse me for saying it, it's more like the New York Stock Exchange. And so, but I also agree with Neha that we have to sort of adapt some of the technical features because it doesn't quite fit. But the core principle is you shouldn't front run your customers. You shouldn't sort of manipulate markets. They should be transparent and efficient. That is not what's happening now. It is clearly not what's happening. These exchanges, in many regards, are a mess.
Well, you like the duck test, right? I have my own, which is not a legal test, but I have my own heuristic, right? Which is regulation appropriately follows trust. And I think that what doesn't get captured in the current regulatory framework, even at the federal level, if we were to apply those standards, is that concept consistently. In other words, if I was able to build an exchange where I could provably never front run my customers,
there you go.
Right? Should I have to live within the same framework and be held to maybe inapposite standards, right? Or can we figure out a framework where these things are pushing people into a technological solution that achieves the policy outcome in a really
I just want
fair
to
way?
tack onto that really quickly before you respond. Another example of that is around custody, right? There are so many laws around custody, but there's a technology-based solution using payment channels and some clever layer 2 and multi-sig and things like that. There's a technology there's technology to help with custody, basically. And so do we need the same exact regulation around what a custodian has to be and do? Does that role even still exist?
So I would say we do need rules. Society benefits from them in terms of custody. In essence, the rules of custody are don't lose a customer's funds, don't use a customer's funds.
But they're more prescriptive than that, right?
Yes, they're more prescriptive, but to use the example of front running, if you can programming an anti-front running regime right into the blockchain, that does not obviate the need to at least have a legal requirement that you have no front running.
Agreed.
But
True.
then you go into the appropriate folks and say, well, can this satisfy that goal? And you work through, and I think there should be accommodations for the new technologies. We've done this before. When the internet came around in the 1990s, there were a lot of accommodations. Some of them worked out reasonably well. Some of them had unintended consequences. We had something called the Enron loophole, where new exchanges, new ways to do electronic trading of derivatives or swaps, we're allowed to stay off the grid, off the policy grid entirely. I'm not saying it's the only reason we had the 2008 crisis, but it was certainly part of the crisis. And looking back now, those of us, because I was involved at the time, should have done more to protect the public. Should have done more to protect the public. There were other accommodations in the securities laws that have had unintended consequences, but they've roughly worked as anticipated, that new bulletin boards allowing trading of securities were brought inside the public policy framework, and it's called Regulation ATS. It was sort of like, you didn't have to be fully like the New York Stock Exchange. You could be a little less regulated, but you still were inside the framework. So I think that there are a lot of lessons from when the internet was first being adopted.
Well, it's no fun talking about where we agree. But anyway, go ahead.
Sure. You want to get to where we disagree?
Yeah, but
Do you
first-
want to talk about maybe about Ripple or Ether?
No. Let's let Patrick say what he was going to say, and then we can get to that.
I'll talk about something else. So your point gets to one that I think is a really important one, which is having regulations that are principles-based. We agree on that. Technologically neutral, we agree on that. I think we agree that regulation should be proportional, right? So these I think, but maybe we found a sense of disagreement, or where is that, right? That proportionality. So these exchanges that we talked about, some of them are very large, right? But it happened very recently that they got that large, and so now saying these frameworks should apply to them sort of makes some more sense, right? But if I'm just starting an exchange and I don't have very many customers, I don't have that much revenue, do we want to encourage that innovation? And if we do, then we need to make sure that these regulations and the rules that we put in place are encouraging both innovation in the technology side by understanding the policy goals and obviating the rules, but also should they be applied in full force at every step along the way for a startup?
You raise a great question, because there's there is a regulatory burden of these,
Yes.
and there's a cost.
And
so,
usually sandboxes address this, right? Or is that the only tool, or are there other tools?
so there's a number of tools. I don't know that we would agree on how far to use these tools, so there might be some differences. But there are a number of tools, in essence, for startups in the registration area. If you're a startup and you're raising less than $50 million US, there are some regulations for that, or Regulation CF for crowdfunding, which are lighter sets of regulations. Now, many entrepreneurs would say they're still too heavy, too prohibitive, but there is a tiering or a tailoring of regulations. I don't know whether we would come to agreement on the exchange side, because still there's a customer, and if a customer is being defrauded, that's kind of a bad thing. I want to raise one other question we might or might not agree on, is there are a lot of people that have been operating in this space. In essence, there's over 1,000 initial coin offerings that are probably non-compliant, sort of a lot of horses out of the barn running on the open field, and nearly 200 exchanges. The question is, what do we do as a society about past misbehavior? And particularly an exchange that might have gotten ill-gotten gains through manipulation and front-running. Should they even be allowed to register? And I think this is sort of an interesting question. Or is it like, well, that was then, this is now, let's move forward? And there might be some
Again, I think
differences
it's about intent, right? And this is something that we have conversations about a lot. It's like, were you setting out specifically to defraud your customers, right? And there are a lot of people in this space who definitely, you could say that they were doing that, right? But or was it that, or were you like willfully negligent? Like you put your thumbs in your ears,
Let me
right?
ask this: what if you were willfully front-running? Front-running means that you get an order from a customer, and the exchange says, if the customer wants to buy Bitcoin at 8,000, then the exchange will buy it maybe at 7,990 at first, and then flip it and sell it to that customer for the $10 spread. That's called front-running.
I don't know the letter of the law, right? But this is an interesting case right here.
It's a violation of trust, though.
Yeah, it is
Right?
totally
So
a
it
violation
feels
of
like
trust.
it should
Yes.
be
It
properly
does feel
regulated.
that
It
way.
is a
Yes.
violation
Yes.
of one of those little technical.
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, no, that seems pretty bad to me, right? I agree with that. But I do want to make a point really quickly about this burden of complying with regulation. I have an interesting fact. I'm not going to name the coin, but I was talking to to someone.
Please.
Nope, it's not a big one.
Okay.
But
All right. We've
not
narrowed
nowhere
it.
near top 10. But this is a project, a startup. They have a coin. They're doing really good work. They're trying really hard. They did a Reg D. They raised under $2 million, spent almost $500,000 on lawyer fees. That's not his. That's not just his fault, Gary. I think the blame lies pretty equal. I think they're just taking advantage of the situation,
I see.
right? I mean, this is atrocious. 25% or more of what you earned had to go to paying your lawyers just so you could comply. Like, they were trying to do it right. Right? This is crazy. This seems crazy to me.
And as a lawyer, I can say that I don't want that outcome either. Like, I would love to see a more streamlined, clearer approach for certain types of startups. Again, proportionality, right? Some players can afford $500,000 in legal fees, and actually that's appropriate, depending on the type of business you're in, right? But for startups that just want to get a token out into the world, and it really is like distributed computational infrastructure, right? Then
I mean, they
that's
did a Reg
really,
D, so it wasn't exactly
right.
But the point is, they were doing the right thing.
Can we get to a clear framework
They were
so that people
good
can do
actors.
this
Yes.
in a cost-effective manner without having to hire a fleet of lawyers to try and figure it out?
I think that you're correct that there is a cost to build trust in the system, and those costs are more readily borne by the big actors. But $6.5 billion was raised in the first quarter through what's called initial coin offerings. One firm alone, Telegram, raised $1.7 billion. So I think that there's room to maneuver, that the $2 million raise is different than a $50 million or a $250 million raise.
Well, one thing that I think that the outcome of where we are right now is that a $2 million raise is just not worth it. That if you're going to do a token issuance, you really need to be in that 25, 30 plus $1 million raise when you factor in professional services fees, taxes, and all the other costs that go into it. If you're going to build that kind of infrastructure, you have to actually raise sufficient capital to be able to deliver
And
on it.
that knocks out, I think, what is the amazing thing
Yes.
about this technology, which is that, you know, your little shop down, it suddenly becomes feasible for you to do these little fundraisers now. It's much more streamlined, but not if you have to give your lawyer,
But there's
you know,
another
a quarter
dynamic
of what you
here.
raised.
So I completely agree, and I agree that it's a problem. I think what we're seeing, though, is, so there's the first movers who tend to take arrows, most of them, but some don't, right?
Some of them get in under the wire,
Some
yeah.
get in, yeah, it's like a temporal regulatory arbitrage, right?
Yeah.
Then you have the second movers, and that's the phase we're in now. And the second movers, you get to be in ahead of most of the people, and if you do it right, you get a huge competitive advantage to everybody who follows later. But you have to pay the cost for building this trusted framework.
Right.
Right?
And-
And so that's what the stage
And
we're in.
can I say what I think will lower the cost? Those who come in that later, third and fourth stage, which, for instance, the internet, I don't know if we're in the fourth stage or what, but they have a little bit lower cost because now there's clarity. Now there's the rules of the
clarity
road are
helps,
there.
certainly. Yeah.
There's service providers.
Right.
You can go on a website and you'll, hopefully in 2019 or in 2020, and this is not going to sort out just in a few months. This is going to take multiple years to sort out, actually.
That's right.
But as it sorts out, there'll be more clarity and service providers that can lower the costs for those.
But from an innovation and entrepreneurial perspective, the downside to clarity is that then everybody can do it cheap. There's much more competition in the market.
Oh, but that's good for society.
I didn't say it's not. I didn't say it's a bad thing. I said if you have an entrepreneurial mindset, right? If you're willing to take the little bit of risk today, the payout is going to be bigger for you because there is less clarity and there's more space to operate with fewer players on the field. Once these rules get very clear and the costs come way down, which I agree that they will over time,
And it will also bring
There'll
in
be more players on the
It will
field.
also bring in the incumbents.
and the incumbents will be able to come in with their user bases and their huge market share and start building into the space
But
as
I would
well.
say that anybody who is pro blockchain technology, and you're listening to this, you might be thinking, "Oh, this is not good. Oh my God, like the age of darkness is coming." I actually think that investor protection, market integrity, enhances markets. And we went through this in the 1930s in a very different time, but we went through it after the Great Depression and the stock market crash. And it's basically been part of the American experience and Western developed nations experience that their economies took off and economic inclusion took off because we could trust these capital markets. And capital markets are rife with conflicts, and we want to lower those conflicts and allow people to save and invest
Right.
for their futures.
And I think part of, where do we get that trust? We think now we can start to get that trust with cryptography, which is the really cool, exciting part. Now, I want to take a question. So if you're watching this live right now, you can leave a comment and ask a question. I don't know how many minutes we have left, but a few. So, get in there. This is from Irene Hernandez, who actually works with the DCI, but we didn't plant her, I promise. I wonder if regulators of different jurisdictions, including those outside the U.S., are participating in a common discussion to build an international regulatory framework.
Irene, it is a very good question. There are those discussions going on, respecting that there's many different cultures and political systems and existing law or code. I've personally participated in some of those conversations with regulators from 8 other countries. Even this morning, I was invited to join a similar such discussion in later next month in Paris. So the discussions are happening, very much so, but I do think we're going to see some fragmentation. We're going to see some countries basically competing to get more participants. Recently, Japan, I think rightly, after one exchange, a crypto exchange, lost $500 million of tokens, just lost. It was a hack. The Japanese authorities said maybe we should examine the rest of these exchanges, and 10 closed, and several have moved to other countries, including Malta. And the Maltese prime minister is very proud of this and has announced he wants more to come. So there'll be some international forum shopping, but I think the large Western and large Asian countries are in discussions, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I want to raise a point about the internet that my friend Madaris told me about, which is that part of the reason the internet developed in the United States and not Europe was due to a friendly sort of regulatory environment for that in the US versus in Europe, right? And so think about things could have been so different. We could have had the Googles and the Facebooks in Europe instead of in the US.
And that came from a statement of principles from the White House and on high that said, we want to support, we don't want to be technology neutral, right?
Really?
We want to support innovation in this particular field of e-commerce. And from those principles, we then developed more permissive regulatory frameworks and even statutory authority that allowed for things like in the DMCA for the YouTubes of the world not being found liable for copyright infringement of their users and things like that. But it all started with a statement of principles that said we want to support innovation in this sphere. That is lacking in this space right now. There isn't a set of clearly announced principles that say this is the type of innovation that we want to support, and we want regulation to follow and flow from those principles.
What were those principles? I would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Are you familiar with the e-commerce principle? I think it was 95.
Oh, the Internet, the Tax Act, right? The one about sales tax.
Well,
Is
that
what
was,
you're
that
referring
was,
to? No.
so in the mid-1990s, as the internet started to get commercialized, there were policy statements out of the then administration, the Clinton administration, in the Clinton White House, just about how to address that. There was also a lot of activity in Congress that led to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And so, aside from that, there was every agency was sort of grappling with, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission were grappling, as I said earlier on this podcast, that that some, I think, got it, with balance. The regulation of alternative trading systems in securities. I think some went too far to the, hey, we're not going to touch this. So I think there's some lessons also from the 90s that says we need to bring it into the framework and then modify. And I think that's pro-innovation. Yeah. I think if you leave it outside of the big goals, then public confidence and everybody then says, well, what is this? This is about funding terrorists?
That's right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about cryptocurrency in general is that it really gives you for this opportunity to just opt out entirely, right? And you could build a system that just opts out entirely from this conversation and says, you regulators aren't part of our community and we don't care, right? And it wouldn't surprise me if some people do that.
Well, they
right?
have.
We have, right?
They have
like
and they will.
They have and they will. People do. But I agree, those markets probably won't have the same type and level of impact on society for the better than the ones who say, we want to bring these people into our community, work with you, figure out a way to bring it into the system.
One of the sort of elephants in the room is the crypto market right now is valued at $400 billion. This is not a small figure. Now, the worldwide capital markets are much larger, more than 100 times larger, but it's still significant. This is not a small amount of, and the transactions, the daily transactions are very large. Just yesterday, the top 10 crypto exchanges in aggregate traded $17 billion in one day. So there's a lot of activity.
We have another question. This one's kind of hard. Also, this is from Mark Weber, also at the DCI. I swear we didn't plant these people. But okay, about the statement of principles for this space. What would you want to see in such a statement? This is a hard one. I think we have to think think about that.
You think we might differ here?
I don't know.
Maybe. I honestly.
Depends on how high level it is, right?
So, and it's not a plug, but at the Berkman Klein Center, we have a great group of amazing people: Primavera de Filippi, John Collins, Carlo Reyes, Nicholas Guggenberger, Nathan Kaiser, Rosemary Lee.
It's not a plug.
Was that a plug? And we are working on this question. So thank you, Mark.
Do you have your children in
there
there
yet?
yet?
And I didn't plant that. That's right.
Look, I think that I might differ. I don't think that this world would necessarily benefit from a statement of principle from this White House. But I am who I am, and I have my views on that. I think, though, if there were such a principle statement, it would be that this is an exciting, innovative technology that has potential, that our laws should be technology neutral, but we should still achieve and ensure that we collect our taxes, that we protect against terrorism attacks and money laundering. We protect investors and consumers and market integrity and ensure for financial stability. And I know that's a lot and it's very high level, but then at least gives a framework. Those are the goals.
Yeah, so it's interesting you talk about sort of KYC and AML. I think that happens at a certain place in the financial system right now, and I could imagine it happening in a very different place in the future. And so the question is, are we open to having that conversation about how it's going to move to a whole different layer? And that's okay. There'll be some downsides and some upsides to that, but, is it all right that
And
happens?
for our listeners, KYC is know your customer and AML is anti-money laundering.
Okay, we have one more question, and we've already gone way over time, but I think this is interesting, so it's fine. So if you have a response, but then I'll ask the next question.
I was just going to say, we're talking about infrastructure that's shared, right, instead of controlled, right? And so that's part of maybe this principles discussion is when you have infrastructure that isn't controlled by one entity or one coalition, right, and it's pushed to the edge in terms of governance, then do you regulate in the infrastructure level or do you regulate at sort of the application level?
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And that's the big question, the push-pull.
And there'll be pros and cons, to moving it as well.
That's
Some
right.
things are going to get harder and worse. Okay, so this question is not from someone at the DCI. Tansaya Benz. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your last name. Kunaratskul. Do you think cryptocurrency will replace the central bank's fiat currency in the future? Should the government be concerned? If so, in what aspects?
I can answer that really quickly.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
It will not. You will see government-backed digital currency that may or may not have aspects that look like cryptocurrency, but it will not be cryptocurrency.
I won't be as categorical as my friend Patrick. I think that it's unlikely to happen in the major countries with large economies, whether they be developing or developed. But I think that it is plausible that you would see it happen in countries in distress, countries that basically
I
are
think there's a chance for that too.
looking to...
That won't be from the central bank, though.
Yeah,
That will
that's
be
true.
people
That's
escaping, opting out.
That's right,
Yeah.
that's
That's
right. But I think that to the extent that the official sector in any country does a reasonable job at protecting the stability of their economy and the stability of their currency, fiat currencies have significant advantages. They're accepted in tax payments, which are generally anywhere from a third to a half of an economy. And so they are backed and protected by their central authorities like central banks and their governments. So they have more trust in society, and they are a medium of exchange. Cryptocurrencies have a major disadvantage, at least now, is that they're highly volatile in terms of their valuations. So it's very hard to use them as what's called a medium of exchange when one day you're not sure whether the next day you need more of them or less than them. And that's usually a destabilizing feature that's happened in countries that have hyperinflation. And there's a great deal of economic study about the destabilizing side of that. So if cryptocurrencies can address some of their volatility issues, and there's some novel and interesting things about stable coins, I think they might be adopted in some countries in distress.
Interesting. Okay, so I think we should probably start to wrap up. So I want to hear if you guys have any sort of closing statements that you want to leave this with. Anything? Any messages?
I think that it seems like a scary, interesting time right now, but I don't think it's really that scary. I don't think people have anything to fear at the moment. I think that we're in this space right now where we have a tremendous opportunity to again, bring people into the community, learn from each other, and develop clearer frameworks. And honestly, I think the regulators could stand a little disruption too, right? And so maybe we can help build better regulatory frameworks through that cooperation.
And I think it's a very exciting time, a new technology that is disrupting ways that we think about the world of finance. I think it can lower the costs and promote economic inclusion, but I truly do think that we need to bring inside the public policy envelope, and yes, that does mean inside the regulatory envelope, thousands of actors that have been sort of running outside of that envelope. And I think that it's the only way to really move forward, even if that means for 6 months to a few years, there's going to be some challenges. I think it will bring greater clarity and greater confidence to anything related to this technology.
Yeah, what's been great for me is just realizing we have to have this conversation. We can't sort of ignore it anymore. We have to have a conversation about what things are and sort of come to terms on what we're doing a little bit more. I think, we mostly agree on the high-level goals. It's the details that have to be worked out, which is always the challenge.
Yes, I guess so we close on the devil is in the details.
Yes, the devil is in the details. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you later.